The decision that history never recorded. It didn't appear in headlines. It wasn't captured in transcripts or archived in reports. And yet, this single moment shaped everything that followed. History moved, without leaving a record of why. This matters now because power is often remembered through visible acts, announcements, declarations, crises, but the most consequential shifts rarely announce themselves. They happen quietly, inside choices that feel too ordinary to document. The billionaire at the center of this story understood visibility. They knew which decisions required formality and which could be handled informally. Over decades, that instinct had served them well. Speed was preserved. Noise was avoided. Momentum stayed intact. The reveal began during a transitional moment. A changing environment demanded adjustment, not a full reversal, not a dramatic pivot, just a subtle shift in direction to accommodate new realities. The billionaire recognized it immediately. The adjustment was obvious to them and unnecessary to explain in detail. So it wasn't. No memo, no formal vote, no recorded rationale. The change was communicated casually. A conversation here, a nod there, enough for those closest to understand what was expected. The decision lived in behavior, not documentation. It felt efficient, elegant, almost invisible. And it worked. For a while, teams adapted quickly. Execution aligned. Results followed. There was no confusion because the people involved were present, informed, and trusted. The decision didn't need a record. Everyone who mattered already knew. That assumption became the risk. As time passed, new leaders entered the system. Advisors rotated. Context shifted. The original environment that made the decision obvious no longer existed. What remained was the outcome, without the explanation. The reveal deepened when questions began surfacing. Why do we do it this way? What problem was this meant to solve? Is this still intentional? No one could answer fully. The decision still guided action, but no one could articulate its origin. It had become tradition without memory, policy without purpose. The billionaire noticed a change when debates emerged around reversing it. Debates that misunderstood what it had been protecting. The decision had not been forgotten. It had been detached from its meaning. And when meaning disappears, decisions become vulnerable. They look arbitrary, outdated, easy to dismiss. What once felt obvious now required defense, and there was nothing to point to. The billionaire sensed the danger clearly. History does not remember what is not recorded, and what history does not remember, it eventually challenges. The conflict was beginning, not over whether the decision was right or wrong, but over whether it had ever been made at all. The consequences surfaced quietly, disguised as healthy debate. New leaders questioned the logic behind long-standing practices. Analysts challenged assumptions that no longer matched current conditions. From the outside, it looked like progress, a system re-examining itself. But something essential was missing. The original decision had been made for reasons no longer visible, pressures that no longer existed, risks that were no longer obvious. Without that context, the choice looked arbitrary, conservative, even irrational. The past had lost its voice. The reveal deepened as recommendations formed to undo the decision entirely. Proposals were well argued. Data supported change. The environment had evolved, they said, and they were right about everything except one thing. They did not know what the decision had prevented. The billionaire listened carefully, aware of the gap widening between action and understanding. Reversing the decision might improve short-term metrics. It might even look visionary, but it would also reopen vulnerabilities the original adjustment had quietly sealed. The conflict sharpened when a reversal was nearly approved. Meetings moved quickly. Consensus formed. The logic felt airtight. And yet, the billionaire felt an unease they recognized well. This was not disagreement with the proposal. It was recognition of a missing memory. The emotional weight settled in. The organization was about to undo something without understanding why it existed. History was being rewritten not by evidence, but by absence. The billionaire asked a simple question in the room. Text equals text dot replace. 94. What problem did this solve when it was made? 94. Silence followed. Not because no one was capable, But because no one had been there, the realization struck hard. The decision had been strong enough to shape behavior for years, but too quiet to survive time. Without a record, it could not defend itself. Without context, it could not argue for relevance. The conflict was no longer about whether to change direction. It was about whether the organization could make decisions responsibly without remembering its own reasoning. Because forgetting the past does not make you modern, it makes you fragile. And unless the lost logic was recovered, the empire was about to repeat a risk it had already learned to avoid once. The conflict reached its peak when the billionaire realized that memory, not strategy, was now the empire's greatest vulnerability. The organization was not making a bad decision. It was making an uninformed one, and the difference mattered. The turning moment came during a final review. Charts were clean, arguments precise. The recommendation to reverse the old decision stood uncontested. On paper, it was a logical move. In reality, it was blind. The billionaire felt the weight of years compress into that room. They remembered the original moment clearly. The pressure, the trade-offs, the near miss that never became public. The risk that had been narrowly avoided. Not through brilliance, but through restraint that felt unremarkable at the time. The decision had never been heroic. It had been protective. And now, that protection was invisible. The emotional tension sharpened as the billionaire recognized a trap. If they intervened, it would appear arbitrary, personal, unsubstantiated. If they stayed silent, the organization would dismantle a safeguard it no longer recognized as intentional. History had lost its evidence. The conflict was no longer about authority. It was about translation. How do you defend a decision whose value existed only in what never happened? How do you prove the importance of an absence? The empire was demanding justification for something that had succeeded precisely because it left no trace. The billionaire understood the deeper danger. Once decisions lose their recorded reasoning, they become vulnerable to revision by every new context. Each generation reshapes them without knowing what they were built to withstand. The organization was moments away from repeating a lesson it had already paid for, quietly, expensively, and without documentation. The conflict crystallized into a single realization. Unrecorded decisions do not age. They erode. And unless the missing context was restored now, the empire would not just reverse a policy. It would reopen a door history had already learned to close and forgotten why. The next move would determine whether memory could be recovered in time, or whether the absence of a record would finally outweigh the wisdom of the decision itself. The climax arrived when the billionaire chose to restore memory before allowing change, not by blocking the reversal, not by asserting authority, but by telling the story that had never been written. They spoke plainly about the moment the decision was made, the pressure that existed then, the risk no one wanted to surface publicly, the trade-off that felt too ordinary to document and too important to ignore, the near failure that never became visible because the adjustment had quietly prevented it. The room changed. What had looked arbitrary gained shape. What had seemed outdated gained context. The decision was no longer a rule without logic. It became a response to a reality the organization had forgotten it once faced. The resolution unfolded carefully. The reversal was paused, not canceled, but reconsidered. Assumptions were tested against the restored context. Some elements of the old decision were no longer necessary. Others remained critical. The outcome was not preservation. It was integration. The organization learned something deeper than whether to keep or change a policy. It learned that undocumented wisdom does not survive success. That when decisions work quietly, they still deserve a record, not for credit, but for continuity. The billionaire reflected on the lesson with sober clarity. History doesn't repeat because people ignore it. It repeats because people forget why past decisions existed. What saved the empire was not authority. It was memory spoken in time. From that moment forward, reasoning was captured alongside outcomes, not to slow action, but to protect meaning. The organization accepted that future leaders would face different conditions, but they would no longer face them blind, because the most dangerous decisions are not the ones that fail. They are the ones that succeed so quietly that no one remembers what they were protecting. And when history forgets its own lessons, the future is forced to relearn them at full cost. So what do you think? How many invisible decisions are shaping our world right now without anyone remembering why? The